Hi, my name is Lauren Michael, and let's talk about Scotland. All right, so on 18th September 2014, Scotland voted no to full independence from the United Kingdom. 44.7% of Scots voted yes, a number that was unprecedented by many analysts. And voter turnout hit 84.6%, which is cool. So it's over and done, right? You know, it was a decisive vote. Scotland stays in the UK. Nothing's going to change. No, not quite. The referendum raises some really interesting questions for the realms of British politics and for international relations. You know, what can the pro-independence campaign tell us about nationalism and politics in Scotland? How did the international community react to the potential of a new independent state? And how will the referendum affect politics in the UK in the future? I mean, there's a general election coming up in May, and this is going to be important. So the referendum takes place at a junction of political waves in Scotland, and I'm just going to really briefly talk about those first. So Scotland has a nationalist party, the Scottish National Party, or the SNP. They started in the 1930s, but really gained traction in the 60s. They have a center-left position, and they have an anti-nuclear stance that comes from Scottish involvement in the campaign for nuclear disarmament. And they also were really amped up by the discovery of North Sea oil. And they ran in its Scotland's oil campaign in the 1970s and 80s that gained them a lot of popularity, which is what that advertisement there is. That's Margaret Thatcher, if you didn't know. So Scotland also now has its own parliament, which it had been attempting to do since the 1970s. There was a first failed attempt in 1979. The parliament is at Holyrood in Edinburgh, and devolution was kind of supposed to quell support for nationalism. At least that's what Tony Blair's government thought that it would do. And the voting system was designed to prevent an SNP majority in the Scottish parliament. So Scots turned to Labour, the Labour Party, during the Thatcher and Major governments of the 1980s and early 90s. The Thatcher and Major governments were really unpopular in Scotland. Particularly, the Thatcher government implemented a poll tax 1 year earlier in Scotland than in the rest of the UK. This caused a lot of resentment, was really unpopular, and still causes resentment today. So in the 1997 election, when Blair's government was elected, Scotland sent 0 Conservative MPs to Westminster, and now they only have 1. At the new Scottish Parliament, support for Labour started to decline for a lot of reasons. There's a perception that Labour politicians are more receptive to the party leaders in London than to Scottish interests. In 2007, the SNP got a minority government in the Scottish Parliament. And then they promised to push for more devolution powers if they got a larger majority, which Labour wouldn't even discuss more devolution powers. So in 2011, Scots elected a majority SNP government, and the party was finally in a position to call a referendum. So in early 2012, First Minister Alex Salmond announces that there's going to be an independence referendum in autumn 2014. And then Yes Scotland and Better Together campaigns for each side of the debate emerge that summer. By October, Alex Salmond and Prime Minister David Cameron have signed the Edinburgh Agreement, which is a set process to give the Scottish Parliament the powers to hold a legal vote. The agreement also gives Holyrood the power to extend franchise, and they do. They extend it to 16 and 17-year-olds, which the SNP has long wanted to do. In exchange for this power, Cameron asks that a second question on a devolution max, or more powers option, be eliminated from the ballot, and it is. November 2013, the Scottish government publishes a white paper on independence, detailing their expected gains from independence, but it's widely criticized for making assumptions about a currency union with the pound and membership in the European Union. In August, 2 televised debates happen, and between Alex Salmond and the leader of Better Together, Alistair Darling, who's a former chancellor. Public opinion overwhelmingly picks Salmond as the leader of the second debate, and on September 6, 2014, a YouGov poll put support for independence at 51%. 2 days before the vote, party leaders at Westminster sign a vow promising additional powers to Holyrood in the event of a no vote. And 1 day before the vote, Gordon Brown, former Prime Minister, delivers a speech in front of Better Together in Glasgow, speaking of all the accomplishments that Scotland has made within the UK. On 18th September, 84.6% of Scots vote in the referendum. The next day, it is announced that Scotland has voted no to independence, 55.3% against, and 44.7% in favor. So I wanted to figure out how did the Yes campaign work? How did it convince so many people to vote for independence? So I looked at newspaper coverage, editorials, campaign speeches, debates, statements, government documents. And the first big thing that I found was that the campaign framed independence as a solution to a democratic deficit. So it kind of plays into the idea that Scotland's future is not in its own hands because of the Conservative government at Westminster that only has the support of one Scottish MP. It's perceived that this government can pass laws that are unpopular in Scotland and they will face no contention for it. It played off existing anti-Westminster sentiment that has built up since the Thatcher government. This is kind of a helpful strategy for the Yes campaign because it puts the Better Together campaign in a really weird position. They can't appear pro-Westminster. So what the Better Together campaign does instead is just focuses on proving wrong the claims that are made in the white paper by the Yes campaign. It's a really negative campaign. They can't really talk about the accomplishments Scotland has made in the UK, or Alex Salmond will accuse them of being in bed with the Tories. You can't really get around that in Scotland. But then Gordon Brown's speech at the end was able to provide that sort of rhetoric, the positive images of Scots and Brits fighting together in 2 world wars, creating the National Health Service, which was the kind of rhetoric that the Better Together campaign had been missing. The second thing that I noticed was that the SNP and the Yes campaign's goals were very vague, sort of social democratic goals, with the exception of policies that they wanted to repeal that already had a lot of broad support in Scotland. NHS cuts, the Trident missile program. There are missiles in Scotland, and a lot of Scots don't want them there. So this was a pretty helpful strategy for the Yes campaign, probably because if you just stick to goals like fairness, equality, prosperity, you're leaving it open so that whatever government is elected to an independent Scotland can decide what those mean. So if we look at a city like Glasgow, which is Scotland's largest city, they voted a majority yes in the referendum, but they also put a majority of Labour MPs in Westminster, SNP MPs at Holyrood, and Labour representatives in their city councils. So there are probably people who are voting for independence, voting yes, who have also voted Labour in other elections, because Scots don't always vote for the same parties in different elections. If the Yes campaign had had too concrete of goals, they couldn't be sure that they were going to have the government of an independent Scotland. And the third thing that I saw was that the referendum campaign was a really big victory for the democratic process and shows us that nationalism in Scotland is civic. We saw very little romantic nationalist rhetoric, even with the anti-Westminster slant of the campaign, and that was really cool because I love it when Braveheart and Mel Gibson turn out to be irrelevant. The campaigns made really special efforts to make voter registration accessible, especially to rural voters. There were a few really strong pro-independence movements for minority ethnic voters, who make up about 4% of Scots. There was very little violence during the campaign, minus a few alcohol-fueled brawls kind of around the vote. It's Scotland. And online harassment from a group called the Cybernats. But the referendum did receive a lot of praise worldwide for its commitment to democracy. Let's talk about the world. This is international relations. So it's kind of thought that a no vote in Scotland could discourage other separatist movements. Probably the most important example is the Catalonian movement in Spain. They have a really strong separatist movement, but a legal vote on independence is forbidden by the Spanish Constitution. But the government in Madrid all but said that it would refuse Scotland EU membership if Scotland became independent. But even when Scotland voted no, the Catalan independence movement basically said that it didn't matter that it had voted no. What mattered was that it had had a democratic opportunity to make that legal decision for itself. So now the Catalonian movement isn't less popular, it has a model for how it wants things to be done. So we still don't know for sure whether an independent Scotland would have been allowed to stay in organizations like the EU and NATO, though it's almost certain it would have had to reapply for membership. And this was really important to the campaign because Scotland tends to be more pro-Europe than the rest of the UK. The UK Independence Party, which is a Eurosceptic anti-immigration party, is very popular in England, but not very popular at all in Scotland. A majority of Scots would vote to stay in the EU if there were a UK-wide referendum. And then for NATO, this was complicated again because Salmond tried to take a pro-NATO stance, but we know Scotland has anti-nuclear leanings, so that would have complicated membership in a defense organization. It's expected in IR that powerful states are going to be in favor of protecting the status quo. That's pretty typical. So it's not surprising that the US, even though it has a number of ties to Scotland, would take a pro-union stance. Millions of Americans claim Scots or Scots-Irish heritage, and the ideas of the Scottish Enlightenment were really important. Think Adam Smith to the development of the U.S. as a nation. But during the campaign, the U.S. seemed pretty sure that Scotland was going to vote no, even though U.S. officials did state that they wanted Scotland to make their own choice because it was democratic, but they really would prefer that the U.K. stay together for stability. And then the possibility that the UK could leave the EU actually seemed to be more important, and Scotland staying in the UK definitely kind of makes it more likely a little bit that the UK would stay in the EU depending on how that was voted on. So this is a Vote Conservative advertisement from March 2015, and if you'd shown this to me I love this ad. If you'd shown this to me a couple months ago, I would have not known at all what it is. And I see you taking a picture. It's cool. Because, Scotland voted no to independence. Shouldn't that mean that they don't want to vote for the SNP, which is a pro-independence party? Not exactly. So the referendum made a lot of people in Scotland more aware of their political grievances. It also, happens that the Labour Party did a pretty botched job at managing the pro-union campaign, and they kind of bothered a lot of people with their negative rhetoric. SNP membership has increased to over 100,000 people, and predicted support for Labour in the upcoming election is hovering kind of between 25 and 30%. The SNP has the possibility of stealing up to 20 seats in the May general election. It probably won't get that many, but that's still kind of a big deal. It's now 94% likely that no party will get an unambiguous majority in Westminster, and no party really wants to have a coalition with another party at this point. A lot of coalitions have been ruled out. David Cameron wants to consider again what's called the West Lothian question, or allowing only English MPs to vote for English laws. And we now know that international interdependence is complicating things for separatist movements, though we never got any definitive answers about the membership question. So is there going to be another referendum is a question that people are asking a lot. I don't think there's really any point in speculating unless you end up being right. That's kind of how it, it's really cool if you predict it and you're right, but if you're wrong, it's like, oh, you were wrong. It kind of depends on what happens in this election and in the future, but I can say pretty confidently that Scotland is not going to be going back to business as usual. Thank you. I think I have does anybody have any questions? I think I have a minute. Yeah?
Can you talk a little bit about nuclear, how much, what their decision is?
Yeah, right. So, so the SNP took an anti-nuclear stance in the 1960s, and it was the only party to do so, mostly because Scottish membership in the campaign for nuclear disarmament was high. A lot of SNP politicians were members. And there was a missile called the Polaris missile that was being housed by the UK government at Holy Loch, which is in Scotland. It's in Argyll, I think. I'm not, all right, no, that's probably not even how you pronounce it. I'm sorry. But it was housed there, and Scotland really didn't want it there because Scotland kind of tends to be more anti-nuclear, and that's a major attraction to voting for this party. So because they're anti-nuclear, then they don't want the missiles stored within the Scottish borders. So, and that's the Trident missile program right now. Like a lot of people in Scotland want the Trident missiles not in Scotland. So, yeah.
So last year, one of my professors told me that most of the missiles that the UK had were in Scotland.
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
And so in the event that they would secede, would they all move to the UK, or would they just...
They probably would have had to vote on it, or have the Scottish Parliament make a decision. And it's not exactly clear what would have happened. Sorry, if it had been a Labour government that had been elected, the missiles might have stayed because Labour would probably prefer that the missiles not leave. If it were an SNP government, then the missiles would probably be gone. Cool. I think I'm out of time.